Good morning, sourdough beginners. So I was just going to come on quickly today. I mixed up the beginner bread recipe this morning. I'm ready to put that dough into proofing containers, and then I've got a second batch that I want to mix up. So I wanted to talk about managing sourdough within your regular everyday life. These recipes take hours. You mix your dough, and then you spend a couple of hours doing stretching and folding, and then your bulk proofing process can take anywhere from 4 to 10 hours, and then you pre-shape and shape, and then your baking takes an hour. And one of the most common questions that we see in the sourdough for beginners group is, how do I manage all of this timing? So in the description for this live, which I'm currently doing on the Facebook page, I've included links to all of the tutorials that we've created that you might need as you're going forward and learning to make sourdough. It's been a couple of weeks since I've baked any bread. A few months ago, I got a call and found out that my dad was quite ill, that he had terminal cancer. And over the past several months, we've been managing that. A couple weeks ago, we transported my dad to hospice, and on Sunday, he passed away very peacefully. And so a while back, I had stuck my starters in the fridge and basically put them to sleep. And this is one of the questions that we see, is that I have to go out of town or I'm going away. What do I do with my starter? In my case, my dad was sick. I couldn't focus on anything else. I needed that time. So how did I manage it? So what I did was I fed my starters, I stuck them in the fridge, and I just set them aside and forgot about them. Now today, I've been giving myself baking therapy all day. I was up at 7. I made sourdough discard chocolate chip cookies. I made sourdough discard banana bread. I mixed up a beginner bread recipe that I planned to bake tonight. The first thing I did this morning was feed my starters. So I pulled my 2 starters out of the fridge. I discarded them, and then I fed them and let them rise. So I used my first starter, Mama, in my bread recipe that I mixed this morning, which I'm about to show you. And I'm going to use Sleepy now to mix up the beginner bread recipe with just a slightly higher hydration. I like to feed my starters when they come out of the fridge to wake them up. And usually on days like today, I'll bake all day. And so I can just use that discard that comes out in order to feed them in discard recipes. So in a little bit, I'll show you all the stuff I made today. My starter is a 60 gram 1:1:1 balance ratio. What that means is that I take 120 grams out of my starter, and then I refeed it 60 grams each of flour and water. 120 grams works out perfectly for the beginner bread recipe that we designed for the group. So the beginner bread recipe is 120 grams of starter, 680 grams of water, and 1,000 total grams of flour, plus 20 grams of salt. Today, I'm going to increase the hydration just a little bit on the beginner bread recipe. I've got tons of experience and I know how these doughs work. And when you increase hydration, you'll see more spring. You'll see a fluffier, lighter bread, but it's much harder to work with, and it's a little bit more finicky in the proofing stage. So like I said, if you're just getting started, make sure you do the beginner bread recipe, practice all of the different steps that come, and some of them we can cover right now, and then start to work on your technique and then change things as you go. So I'm just going to point my camera down at my counter so that you can see everything that I'm working on right now. So here I've got the beginner bread recipe mixed up this morning. It's been stretch and folded 3 times. I'm going to stretch and fold it one more time, and then I'm going to get it moved into my proofing containers. The plan with this dough today is that I'm going to let it proof on the counter, and I'm going to bake it this evening without cold proofing it. After this, I'm going to mix up the beginner bread recipe. I'm going to go through the stretch and fold process, and then I'm actually going to just stick it in the fridge because I'm getting tired and I'm done for the day. I'll pull that dough out in the morning, let it finish proofing, pre-shape it and shape it, and then I'll either bake it or let it cold proof in the fridge. So I'm just going to do a final stretch and fold. I've just made my hand just a little bit wet. I like to get the palm of my hand, and all I'm going to do is give this dough one last stretch and fold. So this is the 4th stretch and fold that I've done for this dough, so you can see that the dough is nice and shiny, it's holding together well, it's ready for proofing. So one test that you can do with your dough is the window pane test, and the stretching and folding builds strength in your dough. Sourdough is too sticky to knead in the traditional way, so we stretch and fold it. And if you look at the dough, as I pull it up, it's getting nice and translucent, and it's not ripping unless I force it. This means that there's enough strength in this dough now, and it can proof. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this dough into 2 equal-sized loaves, just slightly over 900 grams, and get them into my proofing containers. So I'm just going to take my dough, and I'm going to separate it. And this loaf is coming in at 940 grams, including my container, 945. My container weighs about 65 grams. And then I'm going to take this other one, and it's at about 915. So I'll just pull a little bit of the dough from here, get it to 920. All right, so I've got my 2 doughs in these proofing containers. Now, whether you're a beginner or you've got lots of experience, I really recommend that you let your dough do the bulk proofing stage in a clear, straight-sided container. What this does is it lets you watch the dough and really see how much it's risen, so that you can catch it so you can catch it before it overproofs, and make sure that it's not underproofed. So I just take my dough and I just push it into these Tupperware sort of containers that I picked up at Walmart. They're 2-quart containers, and they're more than enough size for what I need with these 2 loaves. So all I'm going to do is just push my dough into these containers and rinse my hands. And I'm going to get the lid on these containers. I'm going to make sure they're nice and dry on the outside. So I'm going to stick the lids on. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Sharpie, and I'm just going to mark the height of my dough. So when you look, you can see that the dough's not touching all of the edges. There's voids. And I just take my marker and mark where my dough is at. So later tonight, my dough usually bulk proofs within 4 or 5 hours. When it's up here, I'll know that it's doubled. And one of the most common issues that we see is people's bread either comes out flat like a pancake, or it comes out very dense and gummy inside. If it's dense and gummy inside, it's underproofed. If it falls flat like a pancake, it's overproofed. And when you proof your dough in a bowl like this, what you've got is a very small bottom and then a widening top. So it's really hard to see how much your dough has risen, whether it's doubled or not. So this method is if you're going to do nothing else, then do this method. So I'm just going to take my marker, and I'm going to mark the dough like this. very messy, and I find that this marker just rinses off when I wash the containers. And I only use these containers for proofing my dough, so I'm not really super duper concerned. But if you look, now my heights are marked, and I'll really be able to see when this is doubled. So all I'm gonna do with this dough right now is set it over beside my stove where it's nice and warm and let it bulk proof, and then I'll bake it tonight. I don't know what my night looks like. Maybe I'll come on and do a live for pre-shaping and shaping, but I'm just going to set these aside. So now I'm going to mix up the beginner bread recipe, but I'm going to increase the hydration a little bit, and I'm also going to increase the amount of sturdier flour. So with the beginner bread recipe, it calls for 120 grams of starter, 680 grams of water, 20 grams of salt, and 1,000 total grams of flour. When you're a beginner, I recommend you do between 8 and 850 grams of either all-purpose or bread flour, and then the balance in a sturdier flour like oat, wheat, spelt, rye flour. Any of these would work. That sort of balance makes the dough really easy to work with. When you start adjusting water or adjusting the types of flour, then other sort of science things start to come into it and make it a little bit trickier. And what I recommend is that you practice the processes until you've got them all down pat, and then start adjusting your recipe. So here's my starter. I fed it this morning, and I'm going to measure 100. I'm just going to stir it down, but you can see it's nice and alive. Some people say pancake. I think it's a little bit thicker than pancake. But I'm going to measure 120 grams of my starter into my bowl. So I'm just going to tare my scale to 0. And I'm going to get this 120 grams in. And now I'm just going to set my starter aside, and after my dough is mixed, I'll refeed it. So now the beginner recipe calls for 680 grams of water, which once you factor in that the starter is half water, puts you at 730 grams. You've got 1,000 grams of flour. That means that the beginner bread recipe is a 73% hydration, including starter, or 68% hydration, not including starter. I want to bring my bread up to a total of 80% hydration today. So what I'm going to do is put 720 grams of water in, and then half of my starter is 60. That brings me to 80%. So I'm just going to go for 720 grams of water right now. But like I said, until you're used to managing the dough, I really recommend that you stay with a lower hydration until you've got all of the processes down pat, you're feeling really confident, and then look at increasing your hydration and your adjusting your flours. So I just take my starter, I add my water, and then I use a whisk, and I blend it until the starter is completely dissolved into the water. You'll get sort of like a nice foamy, sort of milky, watery substance. I just give it a really good mix. Starts to get kind of foamy, nice. Good. Now I try to use my starter at peak. So this morning I knew I was going to be baking, and I know that my starter, Mama takes about 4 hours to peak, and Sleepy takes about 6 hours to peak. So I fed both of them when I woke up this morning, and I just happened to be standing here at peak. If you can't use your starter at peak, it's okay. You can use it after it's peaked. Your starter will start to get runnier as time passes, but if you can use your starter at peak, then you should. Okay, so now I need 1,000 grams of flour. So I'm going to dump about 500 grams of regular all-purpose flour in, and then I'm going to finish up the balance with a blend of whole wheat and spelt flour. So these loaves are going to be full of nice sturdy flours, a lot healthier, you know, all that good stuff. So I'm just going to gently dump my flour into my mix till I get to about 500 grams. And then I'm just going to top it off with my sturdier flours. So I'm just looking for a grand total of 1,000 grams of flour. Whew. Flew up on me a little bit there. All right, so I have 1,000 total grams of flour, and now I'm going to add 20 grams of salt. So I just keep, every time I add something, I just keep tearing my scale back to 0 so I don't lose track. So just 20 grams of salt. Perfect. Now, I keep saying this, I always say it, you don't actually need any real tools that aren't already in your kitchen for sourdough. I can help you convert almost every recipe to cups and teaspoons and measures and everything else. But if you can, you should get a scale. They're like $12 US for this Amazon Basics one. I think it's like 17 bucks Canadian. But it really makes everything easier. If you can maintain your balances, then you can be more consistent. And consistency and repetition are key to getting really good at sourdough. You need to just do the process over and over and over again so that you start to get a feel for how things go. So now I've got this starter water mix underneath my flour and my salt. What I like to do is just take a spoon and sort of blend them all on top. You know, you always see the recipes where they're like, blend the dry ingredients first and then mix them with the wet. But I'm lazy and I like to keep things simple. So I sort of just blend them on top of the water. And then once they start to blend, I just use my spoon and mix up the dough until all of the water is absorbed into the flour. And then I switch to my hand. So I'm just going to give it a good mix. Now, I find that whole wheat flours tend to soak up the water much quicker than all-purpose flour. And so that's why I increase the hydration when I'm working with a higher count of whole wheat flour. My family prefers 100% white flour for their sourdough. They just think it tastes better and it's more fun. And I don't mind making it because, you know, it's much, much healthier than store-bought bread. It's less healthier than sourdough could be if I were to use these high-quality flours. But it's a nice middle ground for me. But still, I like to make these high wheat loaves as well. So I usually just alternate them, and we all negotiate and meet in the middle. So I've got this mixed up. You can see that there's sort of dry spots and everything else. So I'm just going to use my hand, and I guess you could call it kneading the dough, but the dough is so sticky that it's not really kneading. All I'm trying to do right now is get this dough to soak up as much of the water as possible and create a shaggy dough. So here we go. So we're just going to mix it around, get it to all stick together. See my awesome messy hands. So here we go. Okay. So what's next? So I have just taken my first batch that I mixed hours ago and took the morning to stretch and fold into proofing containers. Later tonight, once they've nearly doubled, I usually don't go past doubling, but sometimes I experiment with how long I proof my bread and see what kind of results I get. So once that's done, I'm going to bake those. With this batch, what I'm going to do is stretch and fold 3 or 4 times and then get it into proofing containers. Now, normally what you would do is let your dough proof on the counter, but it's already 2 o'clock. And I most certainly will fall asleep before this is done bulk proofing. So what I'll end up doing with this is putting it into proofing containers and then just leaving it in the fridge overnight. And then in the morning I'll pull it out and I'll just let it finish proofing and continue on from there. So people are a little bit afraid of, you know, the fridge, but the fridge can really, really help you manage things when you've got a busy life. And I think everybody has a busy life, and it's not very often that somebody has basically 16 hours to dedicate to something. And so I've just put a ton of thought and practice into how do we make this work. And then, you know, as I said at the beginning of this live, you know, recently I had a really big event happen with my dad being sick and eventually passing away. And, you know, I didn't have to worry about my sourdough not being good anymore. So just before I end this live, all I'm going to do is just refeed my starter. So this starter, like I said, is a 60 gram 1-to-1 ratio. So I'm just going to tear my scale to 0. So the scale is sort of ignoring the weight of the starter that's already in there, the container, and the knife. And I'm going to dump 60 grams each of all-purpose flour and water into my starter and then mix them up. I like to use these very wide mouth containers for my starters. They just make it easier to mix. I got these from a lady who makes pickles, and I just wash them out really good when the pickles run out and use them. I actually just ordered a 25 pack of these off of Amazon because I'm planning on giving a ton of starters away for Christmas. So 60 grams of flour in there, tear the scale back to 0, and then we're just going to add 60 grams of water. Here we go. And then I'm just going to mix it up. Now, I've said this before, but I think it's worth saying again. I am firmly in the sealed lid camp for starters. You know, you read a lot of things on the internet when you start working with sourdough, and one of the things you read, well, I think there's just a lot of stuff out there that's a little overcautious. People say don't use metal. People say, you know, don't wash any of your containers with soap. You know, I just think that if you're being as cautious as you can be and as careful as you can, it's not really necessary to take this so seriously. You can be a little bit laid back. But with a sealed lid on your starter, starter's a culture. It's a fermented, you know, you're taking flour and water and you're letting it ferment. It creates alcohol, it creates gases, it creates all kinds of organisms. And I don't believe that there's anything in the air that a starter needs. So keeping a lid that is loose or breathable is not something that I buy into personally. But everybody, you know, probably there may be good reason for it. And then in regards to gases building up and worrying about sort of the container breaking or the lid popping off, if you use a container that's big enough, so this is a 1 liter, 1,000 mil container. A liter is just over a quart in the States. Makes it so that you don't ever have to worry about those things. The highest my starters ever rise is here. So sometimes they'll triple or come way up, but I've never once had my lid pop off. And then lastly, fruit flies feed on fermented organisms. And so a really great way to infest your house with fruit flies is to have a starter that's sort of distributing its gases through your kitchen. So that was a really long way of saying I keep a sealed lid. That's it. So here we go. My starter's refed. I'm just going to set it over beside the oven and let it regrow. So I'm just going to